In the frozen peaks of Pine Ridge Valley, a hermit who claimed he needed nothing more than shelter was about to discover that the smallest acts of kindness could crack open the most fortified hearts. Thomas Mitchell had spent 8 years convincing himself that solitude was strength, that needing no one meant never losing anyone again. He couldn't have predicted that a simple request for help would force him to choose between the safety of isolation and the dangerous territory of caring for others once more. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to Whispering Pines Mountain like a shroud, wrapping around the weathered cabin that sat perched on Sunset Ridge like a forgotten prayer. Thomas Mitchell stepped onto his narrow porch, coffee mug in hand, and surveyed the valley spread below him through eyes that had grown accustomed to seeing nothing but trees and sky. 8 years of self-imposed exile had taught him to find peace in the emptiness, to measure his days by the movement of shadows across his single room rather than the complications that came with human contact. His cabin was exactly what he'd told himself he needed: 4 walls, a roof, and a corner to sleep. The structure measured barely 12 by 12 feet, containing nothing beyond the absolute essentials: a narrow cot pushed against the far wall, a wood-burning stove that served for both heat and cooking, a small table with 1 chair, and shelves that held only the supplies necessary for survival. No photographs adorned the walls, no mementos cluttered the surfaces, no evidence remained of the man he'd been before the mountain claimed him. Tom had chosen this spot deliberately, 3 miles up a winding trail that discouraged casual visitors and 2 hours by foot from the nearest neighbor. The isolation suited him perfectly, or so he'd convinced himself, during the long winter evenings when the wind howled through the pines and the only sound was his own breathing. He'd become a master of minimalism by necessity and choice, paring down his existence until it contained nothing that could disappoint him, nothing that could be lost, nothing that could break his heart again. The valley below showed signs of early winter's approach. Pine Ridge Valley had always been a place where people looked out for each other, where neighbors knew each other's names and troubles, where community meant something more than just proximity. Tom watched the smoke rising from chimneys in the distance, each wisp a reminder of the warmth and connection he'd deliberately abandoned. Sometimes on particularly clear mornings like this one, he could make out the figures of people going about their daily routines, small as ants from his elevated perch, living lives that intersected and mattered to each other in ways he'd forgotten how to navigate. Elena Rodriguez had been running the corner diner for 15 years, long enough to know the rhythm of the town and the stories behind every face that walked through her doors. She'd heard whispers about the hermit on Whispering Pines Mountain, caught glimpses of him during his rare trips to town for supplies, noted the way he moved through Mary Chun's general store like a man trying to be invisible. Elena possessed the kind of intuitive understanding that came from years of serving coffee to troubled souls and listening to the unspoken stories that lived in the spaces between words. This particular morning found her preparing for what promised to be another challenging day. The diner served as more than just a place to eat in Pine Ridge Valley. It functioned as the unofficial town hall, the place where news spread and problems were discussed over plates of eggs and endless cups of coffee. Lately, those conversations had taken on an increasingly worried tone as rumors circulated about outside interests eyeing their small community with predatory attention. Sheriff Mike Carson pushed through the diner's front door just as Elena finished setting up for the morning rush, his weathered face carrying the expression of a man who'd slept poorly and expected the day to offer little improvement. Mike had been wearing the badge in Pine Ridge Valley for over 20 years, long enough to remember when Tom Mitchell had been a different man entirely, before tragedy had driven him up the mountain and into a silence that had lasted nearly a decade. "Morning, Elena." Mike nodded, settling onto his usual stool at the counter, and accepting the coffee she poured without being asked. Elena had learned to read the subtle variations in Mike's expressions, and today she saw something that made her pause in her morning routine. The sheriff was carrying news, the kind that would ripple through their small community like stones thrown into still water. "What's eating at you today?" Elena asked, refilling his cup before he'd taken more than a few sips. Mike Carson had never been a man to hide his troubles, but she could see him weighing his words carefully, choosing how much to reveal and how much to keep close until he better understood what they were facing. "Got a call from the county office yesterday," Mike said finally, his voice carrying the careful neutrality he used when delivering news that nobody wanted to hear. "Seems we've got some interest from outside developers. Company called Mountain Vista Holdings has been asking questions about property values, mineral rights, water access." Elena felt her stomach tighten as Mike continued. "They've been particularly interested in the upper mountain areas, places where folks might not be expecting company." Elena's hands stilled on the coffee pot as the implications settled over her like a cold draft. Mountain Vista Holdings sounded like the kind of corporate entity that saw places like Pine Ridge Valley not as communities, but as opportunities, collections of assets to be acquired and optimized for profit. She'd seen what happened to small towns when outside money decided they had potential that the current residents weren't properly exploiting. "How serious are they?" Elena asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer from the grim set of Mike's shoulders. "Serious enough that they've sent advance scouts," Mike replied. "Brad Stevens rolled into town yesterday afternoon. Claims to be conducting environmental surveys, but he's been asking an awful lot of questions about who owns what and how attached folks might be to staying put." The diner's front door chimed as Dr. Amy Foster entered, bringing with her the crisp morning air and the purposeful energy that characterized everything she did. Amy had come to Pine Ridge Valley straight out of medical school 5 years ago, drawn by the challenge of serving a rural community and the promise of making a real difference in people's lives. She'd quickly established herself as someone the town could depend on, treating everything from childhood scraped knees to serious injuries with equal competence and compassion. Elena automatically reached for another coffee cup as Amy approached the counter, noting the slight tension in the doctor's movements that suggested she too was carrying concerns this morning. The three of them had formed an unofficial leadership council over the years, the kind of natural alliance that develops in small communities, where people with different skills and perspectives learn to rely on each other. "Let me guess," Amy said, accepting her coffee with a grateful nod. "Mountain Vista Holdings sent someone to ask you about the medical facilities and whether the community might be interested in more modern healthcare options." Mike and Elena exchanged glances that confirmed Amy's suspicions. These corporate scouts weren't just gathering information randomly. They were conducting a systematic evaluation of Pine Ridge Valley's vulnerabilities and assets. Elena moved efficiently around the diner as they talked, preparing for the morning customers who would begin arriving soon. The familiar routine of checking supplies, wiping down surfaces, and ensuring everything was ready for another day provided a comforting counterpoint to the uncertainty they were discussing. She'd built something valuable here in Pine Ridge Valley, something that extended far beyond the simple transaction of serving food for money. The diner had become a gathering place where Jake Williams could do his homework after school while his mother worked her second job, where Mary Chun could rest her feet and share stories about the early days of the valley, where Father Robert Hayes could find common ground with people who might never set foot in his church, but still valued the kind of moral compass he provided. Elena understood that places like this couldn't be replicated by corporate efficiency. They grew organically from years of shared experiences and genuine care for the people they served. Mike was explaining what he'd learned about Mountain Vista Holdings when the conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Jake Williams himself, though several hours earlier than his usual after-school appearance. "Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time," So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The teenager looked unusually agitated as he burst through the door, his backpack slung over one shoulder and his face flushed from what appeared to be a hurried bike ride down from the residential area near the school. "Mrs. Rodriguez," Jake called out, not bothering with his usual polite greeting. "You need to see this." He fumbled in his backpack and produced a crumpled flyer, the kind of cheaply printed announcement that gets stuffed into mailboxes or taped to utility poles. Elena accepted the paper and smoothed it out, her expression growing increasingly serious as she read. "Community information meeting," the flyer announced in bold letters, followed by details about a presentation scheduled for that evening at the Pine Ridge Community Center. Mountain Vista Holdings cordially invites all residents to learn about exciting development opportunities that could bring prosperity and progress to Pine Ridge Valley. Elena passed the flyer to Mike, who scanned it quickly before handing it to Amy. "They're moving fast," Mike observed, his tone suggesting this wasn't entirely unexpected but was happening sooner than he'd hoped. Usually takes these companies months to get to the public presentation stage. Amy studied the flyer with the careful attention she normally reserved for medical charts, looking for details that might reveal more than the obvious message. "Look at the fine print," Amy said, pointing to a section near the bottom. "Preliminary agreements and non-disclosure protocols will be available for interested property owners." That sounds like they're not just presenting ideas, they're ready to start making offers. Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air seeping through the diner's windows. Non-disclosure agreements meant that once people started talking seriously with Mountain Vista Holdings, they wouldn't be able to discuss those conversations with their neighbors. It was a strategy designed to isolate community members from each other, to prevent the kind of collective decision-making that small towns relied on for survival. Jake had been listening to their conversation with the intense focus that teenagers reserved for topics that directly affected their lives. At 16, he was old enough to understand that changes to Pine Ridge Valley would impact his future in ways that adults might not fully consider. The mountain community was the only home he'd ever known, and the idea of corporations reshaping it according to distant profit motives filled him with a anger he wasn't quite old enough to articulate effectively. "What about Tom Mitchell?" Jake asked suddenly, surprising the adults with both his directness and his insight. If they're interested in the upper mountain areas, his place would be right in the middle of whatever they're planning. Elena, Mike, and Amy exchanged glances that acknowledged both the accuracy of Jake's observation and the complication it represented. Tom Mitchell had become something of a local legend during his 8 years of self-imposed isolation, a figure who existed on the edges of community consciousness like a character from an old folktale. Most residents had stories about glimpsing him during his infrequent trips to town, noting how he moved through their streets like a man trying not to disturb the air around him. His choice to live alone on Whispering Pines Mountain had been respected as the decision of a man who'd earned the right to privacy, though speculation about his reasons had provided fodder for countless conversations over the years. Mike Carson knew more about Tom's background than most, having worked with him years ago when Tom had been part of the county's search and rescue team. Before the incident that had driven him up the mountain, Tom Mitchell had been the kind of man other men looked up to. Someone whose knowledge of wilderness survival and emergency response had saved dozens of lives over the years. Mike had watched his friend retreat from the world after losing his entire team in an avalanche, understanding that some wounds went too deep for conventional healing. "Someone needs to warn him," Elena said, her practical nature asserting itself over the complicated emotions that surrounded Tom's deliberate isolation. "Whether he wants to be part of this community or not, he deserves to know what's coming." Mike nodded slowly, though his expression suggested he wasn't looking forward to the conversation. "Tom doesn't exactly welcome visitors," Mike said carefully. "Last time I tried to check on him, about 2 years ago, he made it pretty clear that He preferred to be left alone. Amy Foster had been listening to this exchange with growing interest. Her medical training making her naturally curious about the psychological factors that would drive someone to such complete withdrawal from human contact. What happened to make him choose that kind of isolation? Amy asked, though she was careful to frame the question as professional interest rather than gossip. Mike considered how much to reveal, weighing Tom's privacy against the current circumstances. That might force him back into contact with the world whether he wanted it or not. Tom used to lead search and rescue operations for the whole county, Mike explained. One of the best we ever had. Could track someone through terrain that would lose most people. Knew how to keep people alive in conditions that should have killed them. 8 years ago, he was leading a team to rescue some climbers caught in an early blizzard up on Devil's Peak. Avalanche took out the whole rescue team except for Tom. The silence that followed. Mike's explanation stretched long enough for Elena to refill everyone's coffee and for Jake to absorb the implications of what he'd heard. Elena had wondered about the mountain hermit for years, noting how his rare appearances in town carried an air of barely controlled grief that made people instinctively give him space. Now she understood that Tom Mitchell wasn't just choosing solitude. He was carrying the weight of survivor's guilt so heavy that it had required physical distance from anything that might remind him of his failure to save the people who had trusted him. How many people did he lose? Amy asked, softly, her medical background making her sensitive to the kind of trauma that could drive someone to such extreme isolation. All of them, Mike replied simply. 4 experienced rescuers who'd worked with Tom for years, people who'd trusted his judgment and followed his lead into conditions that turned deadly faster than anyone could have predicted. Elena absorbed this information while continuing her morning preparations, understanding now why Tom Mitchell had chosen a life that required nothing from anyone and offered nothing to anyone in return. If you'd failed to protect the people who'd depended on you most, if you'd survived when better people had died, the logical response might be to ensure that nobody ever depended on you again. The philosophy of needing nothing more than a corner to sleep wasn't just minimalism, it was a form of penance. The diner's door chimed again as Father Robert Hayes entered, bringing with him the quiet dignity that had made him a respected figure in Pine Ridge Valley, despite the fact that many residents rarely attended church services. Robert had a gift for meeting people where they were rather than where he thought they should be, which had earned him trust that extended far beyond his congregation. "Morning, everyone," Robert said, settling onto a stool next to Jake and accepting the coffee Elena offered. "I see you've all heard about tonight's meeting." Elena noted that the priest's tone carried concern rather than excitement, suggesting that his perspective on Mountain Vista Holdings aligned with their own growing wariness. "What's your take on all this?" Father Elena asked, knowing that Robert's position in the community gave him insights into how people were responding to the sudden corporate attention. Robert considered his words carefully, as he always did when discussing matters that could affect the entire community. "I've been visiting some of the older residents this morning," Robert said slowly. "Mary Chun is worried about what development might mean for people on fixed incomes. The Morrison family is torn between the promise of jobs and the fear of losing the land. That's been in their family for 3 generations. People are scared, but they're also tempted by the possibility that outside money might solve problems they've been struggling with for years." Elena understood the complexity Robert was describing. Pine Ridge Valley existed in the precarious economic balance that characterized many rural communities, offering a quality of life that couldn't be measured in purely financial terms, but struggling to provide the economic opportunities that young people needed to build futures. The promise of development money would appeal to residents who'd watched their children leave for cities because the mountain community couldn't offer them the kind of careers they'd trained for. Jake shifted restlessly on his stool, the energy of youth making it difficult for him to sit still during conversations that moved at a dull pace. Elena recognized the signs of a teenager, with something important to say, but uncertain about whether his contribution would be welcomed in a discussion among adults. "What are you thinking?" Jake Elena encouraged, having learned over the years that the boy often offered perspectives that adults missed. Jake straightened slightly, grateful for the invitation to participate in a conversation that would affect his future as much as anyone's. "I was thinking about Tom Mitchell," Jake said carefully. "If these development people really want the upper mountain areas, and if he really doesn't want anything to do with people, what happens when they try to buy his land?" Elena, Mike, Amy, and Robert exchanged glances that acknowledged the insight behind Jake's question. Tom Mitchell's property represented a potential obstacle to any large-scale development plans for the upper mountain areas. His cabin sat on land that commanded views of the entire valley, controlled access to some of the best water sources, and occupied a position that would be crucial for any company wanting to develop the mountainside. More importantly, Tom's 8 years of isolation had likely left him unprepared for the kind of sophisticated pressure that corporate land acquisition specialists could bring to bear. "Someone really does need to warn him," Amy said, echoing Elena's earlier sentiment, but with growing urgency. "He may not want to be part of this community, but he's still part of it whether he likes it or not. What affects the valley affects him, too." Mike nodded slowly, though his expression suggested he wasn't optimistic about Tom's receptiveness to outside advice. "I'll head up there this afternoon," Mike decided. "He may not want to see me, but he needs to know what's coming." Elena felt a surge of respect for the sheriff's willingness to undertake what would clearly be an uncomfortable conversation for the sake of keeping everyone informed. The morning rush began in earnest as other residents started arriving for their daily coffee and the community updates that Elena's diner provided better than any newspaper. Word of the evening meeting had spread quickly through Pine Ridge Valley's informal communication networks, and Elena found herself serving as an unofficial information clearinghouse, as people stopped by to share what they'd heard and learn what others knew. Each new arrival brought additional pieces of the puzzle that Mountain Vista Holdings represented. The company had apparently been conducting quiet research on Pine Ridge Valley for months, gathering information about property values, natural resources, recreational potential, and infrastructure needs. Their presentation would likely include detailed proposals that suggested they understood the community's vulnerabilities and opportunities better than many residents realized. Elena moved through the familiar rhythm of serving breakfast and facilitating conversation, but her thoughts kept returning to the mountain hermit who'd chosen isolation over the messy complications of human connection. Tom Mitchell had built himself a life that required nothing beyond basic survival, but that same isolation might leave him unprepared for the sophisticated pressures that were about to descend on their entire community. As the morning progressed and more residents stopped by to discuss the evening's meeting, Elena began to understand that Pine Ridge Valley was facing a choice that would define its future. They could maintain the independence and character that had drawn people to the mountains in the first place, or they could accept the security and development that corporate investment promised. The decision would require the kind of community cooperation that Tom Mitchell had deliberately placed himself outside of, but his choice to remain isolated might not protect him from the consequences of whatever his neighbors decided. The conversation continued around Elena's counter as Pine Ridge Valley began to wake up to the reality that their quiet mountain community had attracted attention from forces much larger and more determined than anything they'd faced before. And 3 miles up a winding mountain trail, Tom Mitchell continued his morning routine, unaware that the isolation he'd cultivated so carefully was about to be tested by circumstances beyond his control. The afternoon sun cast sharp shadows across the mountain trail as Sheriff Mike Carson made his way up the winding path toward Tom Mitchell's cabin. Each step took him deeper into territory that felt increasingly removed from the civilized world below, where roads had names and houses had numbers, and people lived lives that intersected in predictable ways. The trail to Sunset Ridge had been carved by deer and maintained by Tom's occasional passage, a narrow ribbon of packed earth that demanded attention from anyone foolish enough to attempt it without proper respect for the mountain's unpredictable moods. Mike had made this journey only twice before in the 8 years since Tom had retreated to his self-imposed exile, and both previous visits had ended with conversations that felt more like negotiations between strangers than exchanges between men who had once trusted each other with their lives. The Tom Mitchell who had emerged from the avalanche that claimed his rescue team had been a fundamentally different person from the man Mike had worked alongside for years, as if the trauma had burned away everything except the essential core of survival. The sheriff paused at a familiar bend in the trail where a massive pine had fallen years ago, creating a natural landmark that marked the halfway point to Tom's cabin. From this vantage point, Mike could see back down into Pine Ridge Valley, where the afternoon light revealed the community spread out like a detailed map of human ambition and compromise. Houses clustered around the main street where Elena's diner anchored one end and Mary Chun's general store marked the other, with the school and community center forming the heart of civic life that bound the residents together in ways both obvious and subtle. The sight reminded Mike of why he'd undertaken this difficult conversation. Pine Ridge Valley represented something increasingly rare in a world dominated by corporate efficiency and urban sprawl. A place where people still knew their neighbors, names and stories, where community decisions emerged from kitchen table discussions rather than boardroom presentations. The arrival of Mountain Vista Holdings threatened to transform their mountain home into something unrecognizable, and Tom Mitchell's isolation wouldn't protect him from the changes that corporate development would bring to every acre of the valley. Mike resumed his climb, noting the subtle signs that marked the transition from community land to the territory that Tom had claimed through 8 years of solitary occupation. The trail became more challenging here, winding through stands of aspen and pine that blocked most of the afternoon light and created an atmosphere of cathedral quiet broken only by the sound of wind through branches and the distant call of birds that had learned to associate human presence with the rare figure of the mountain hermit. As the sheriff rounded the final curve before Tom's clearing, he caught his first glimpse of the cabin that had become legend among Pine Ridge Valley residents. The structure appeared to have grown from the mountainside itself, its weathered wood siding blending seamlessly with the surrounding forest until it seemed less like human construction than natural phenomenon. Tom had built his retreat with the same attention to essential function that characterized everything about his new life, creating shelter that provided protection from the elements, while demanding nothing more from the environment than absolutely necessary. The cabin sat in a small clearing that offered commanding views of the valley below while remaining virtually invisible to anyone not specifically looking for it. Tom had chosen his location with the strategic thinking of a man who understood both the value of observation and the necessity of remaining unobserved, positioning himself where he could monitor the world he'd abandoned without being forced to participate in its daily complications. Mike approached the cabin slowly, making enough noise to announce his presence without appearing threatening or overly aggressive. 8 years of isolation could make a man nervous about unexpected visitors, and the sheriff had no desire to startle someone who possessed Tom's wilderness survival skills and justified reasons for wanting to be left alone. The silence that greeted his approach felt different from the peaceful quiet of the forest, charged with the awareness that came from being watched by someone who had learned to evaluate every sound and movement for potential danger. Tom appeared in the cabin doorway as Mike reached the edge of the clearing, emerging from the shadows with the fluid movement of a man who had spent years moving through wilderness terrain, where a single misstep could prove fatal. 8 years. of mountain living had changed him in ways that went beyond the expected weathering of sun and wind and seasonal extremes. He moved with the economical grace of someone who had eliminated every unnecessary motion from his daily routine, and his eyes held the distant focus of a person who had grown accustomed to measuring time by the movement of shadows, rather than the demands of human schedules. The two men studied each other across the clearing with the careful assessment of former allies who had become strangers through circumstance rather than choice. Mike noted how Tom's hand remained within easy reach of the axe he'd been using to split firewood, not from paranoia but from the ingrained caution of someone who had learned to treat every unknown situation as potentially dangerous. Tom observed the sheriff's approach with the detached interest of a man watching events that might affect him, but over which he had no control and no desire to influence. "Mike Carson," Tom said finally, his voice carrying the roughness of someone who rarely had occasion to use it for extended conversation. "Been a while." The greeting acknowledged their shared history, while making it clear that the passage of time had not increased Tom's enthusiasm for social interaction. Mike nodded, understanding that his reception could have been much less welcoming given Tom's well-established preference for solitude. "Afternoon, Tom," Mike replied, stopping at a respectful distance that honored the invisible boundary Tom had drawn around his retreat. "Hope you don't mind the intrusion, but there's something happening in the valley that you should probably know about." Tom's expression didn't change, but Mike caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested increased attention, despite his studied indifference to world beyond his clearing. "Corporate developers have started sniffing around Pine Ridge Valley," Mike continued, choosing his words carefully to convey the seriousness of the situation without sounding like he was trying to manipulate Tom into caring about community affairs. "Company called Mountain Vista Holdings has been asking questions about property values and mineral rights, showing particular interest in the upper mountain areas." Tom resumed splitting firewood as Mike spoke, his movements maintaining the steady rhythm that had been interrupted by the sheriff's arrival. To an outside observer, his apparent indifference to the news might have suggested that 8 years of isolation had burned away any concern for events that didn't directly threaten his immediate survival. Mike knew better, recognizing the subtle signs that indicated Tom was processing the information and considering its implications even as he continued his daily routine. "They've called a community meeting for tonight," Mike added, watching Tom's face for any reaction to the news that Pine Ridge Valley was facing decisions that would affect everyone in the area. "Mountain Vista Holdings wants to present development opportunities to the residents, probably start making offers to property owners who might be interested in selling." The rhythmic sound of Tom's axe splitting wood continued without pause, each stroke delivered with the mechanical precision of someone who had reduced physical labor to its most efficient components. Mike understood that Tom's apparent indifference was a protective mechanism rather than genuine lack of concern, a way of maintaining emotional distance from problems that might require him to acknowledge connections to the world he'd abandoned. "Your place would be right in the middle of whatever they're planning," Mike said finally, deciding that directness might penetrate Tom's defensive detachment more effectively than gentle suggestion. "This clearing commands the best views in the valley, controls access to the watershed, sits on land that any serious development would need to incorporate somehow." Tom's axe paused mid-swing, held motionless for a moment before resuming its work, with perhaps slightly more force than strictly necessary. Mike recognized the pause as the first sign that his message was reaching past the barriers Tom had erected against caring about anything beyond his immediate survival. The sheriff pressed his advantage carefully, understanding that pushing too hard might cause Tom to retreat even further into defensive isolation. "I figured you deserved to know what's coming," Mike said, stepping back slightly to signal that he wasn't trying to force a conversation Tom didn't want to have. "These corporate types can be pretty aggressive when they want something, and they've got resources that most folks around here aren't prepared to deal with." Tom set down his axe and turned to face Mike directly for the first time since the sheriff's arrival. 8 years of mountain living had carved lines around his eyes and weathered his face to leather toughness, but Mike could still see traces of the man who had once led rescue operations with absolute confidence in his ability to bring people home safely. The transformation wasn't just physical. Tom carried himself like someone who had accepted that caring about other people inevitably led to loss too devastating to survive twice. "What kind of aggressive?" Mike asked quietly, his question acknowledging both his professional interest and his personal concern for a man who had once been among his closest friends. Tom considered the question with the careful attention he gave to all potential threats, evaluating information that might affect his carefully constructed isolation. "The kind that doesn't take no for an answer," Tom said finally, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood how the world worked. When large amounts of money were involved, these development companies have lawyers and surveyors and people who specialize in convincing property owners that selling is in their best interest whether they originally thought so or not. Mike nodded, understanding that Tom's assessment was probably accurate despite his years of deliberate disconnection from community affairs. The mountain hermit might have chosen isolation, but he hadn't lost the analytical skills that had made him valuable as a search and rescue specialist, or the understanding of human nature that had kept him alive in situations where others had died. "They might try to make you an offer," Tom continued, moving to stack the wood he'd split into neat piles that would dry properly for winter burning. "When you turn them down, they'll probably try to find ways to make staying here less comfortable. Corporate pressure can be pretty creative when it wants something badly enough." The two men stood in the clearing as afternoon shadows began to lengthen, each lost in thoughts about the implications of corporate attention for a community that had always operated on the assumption that they were too small and remote to attract outside interest. Mike understood that Tom's isolation wouldn't protect him from the kind of systematic pressure that development companies could apply, while Tom was beginning to recognize that 8 years of deliberate withdrawal from human contact might have left him unprepared for sophisticated threats that required community cooperation to resist effectively. "You planning to attend tonight's meeting?" Mike asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Tom's expression confirmed his expectation, carrying the look of a man who had made peace with his decision to remain outside the collective decision-making processes that bound communities together in times of crisis. "Not my concern," Tom replied, though his tone suggested the words required more effort than they had 8 years ago when he'd first retreated to the mountain. "I don't need much, just a corner to sleep and enough space to be left alone. Whatever happens in the valley doesn't affect me as long as people respect my boundaries." Mike studied his former friend with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades reading people under stress, noting the subtle signs that suggested Tom's philosophy of complete detachment was requiring more conscious effort to maintain than it had in previous years. The sheriff wondered if 8 years of isolation might have begun to wear away some of the protective numbness that had initially made solitude preferable to the pain of human connection. "You sure about that?" Mike asked gently, choosing his words carefully to avoid sounding like he was challenging Tom's carefully constructed worldview. "These development types don't usually limit themselves to willing sellers. They tend to want entire areas for their projects, which means they're not likely to leave you alone just because you're not interested in participating." Tom resumed his wood stacking with movements that had become slightly more aggressive, suggesting that Mike's words were penetrating the emotional armor he'd spent years constructing. The sheriff recognized the signs of internal conflict in someone who had deliberately trained himself not to care about outcomes he couldn't control, but was discovering that complete indifference was harder to maintain when circumstances began changing around him. "I've gotten along fine without the valley for 8 years, Tom said finally, his voice carrying the forced conviction of someone trying to convince himself as much as his listener. Don't see why that would change now just because some corporation has ideas about development. People down there will make whatever decisions they make, and I'll deal with whatever consequences come my way. Mike nodded slowly, understanding that Tom's determination to remain uninvolved was rooted in psychological survival rather than simple stubbornness. The man who had lost his entire rescue team to an avalanche had learned to protect himself by refusing to care about outcomes that might require him to risk other people's lives or his own emotional well-being. Asking him to engage with community affairs meant asking him to open himself to the possibility of failure and loss again. Fair enough, Mike said, preparing to take his leave while the conversation remained relatively civil. Just thought you should know what might be heading your way. Tom nodded curtly, the gesture acknowledging both the information and his desire to see the conversation end before it ventured into territory that might require him to examine his chosen isolation more critically. As Mike turned to begin his descent back to Pine Ridge Valley, Tom called after him in a voice that carried unexpected concern despite his studied indifference to community affairs. Mike, these corporate types who are sniffing around the valley. They the kind who might try to use pressure on people who can't defend themselves. The sheriff paused, recognizing that Tom's question revealed cracks in the emotional walls he'd built around himself. Despite 8 years of deliberate withdrawal from human connection, the man who had once dedicated his life to protecting others hadn't completely eliminated his instinct to worry about people who might be vulnerable to forces beyond their control. They're the kind who do whatever they think they can get away with, Mike replied honestly. Most of the folks in Pine Ridge Valley are good people, but they're not necessarily prepared to deal with the kind of sophisticated pressure that development companies can bring to bear. Corporate lawyers and financial incentives can be pretty convincing when people are worried about their economic future. Tom absorbed this information with visible reluctance, clearly struggling between his commitment to emotional detachment and the ingrained protective instincts that had once made him an exceptional search and rescue specialist. Mike could see the internal conflict playing out across features that had been weathered by 8 years of mountain living, but hadn't lost their essential humanity despite deliberate isolation from human contact. The sheriff began his descent without pressing for any further response, understanding that Tom needed time to process the implications of what he'd learned without feeling like he was being manipulated into caring about people he deliberately trained himself to forget. The trail back to Pine Ridge Valley seemed shorter than the upward journey, as if the mountain itself was eager to return him to the community that needed his leadership in the challenging hours ahead. Meanwhile, in Pine Ridge Valley, the afternoon was progressing with the kind of barely controlled energy that preceded significant community events. Elena's Diner had become an unofficial headquarters for residents, trying to understand what Mountain Vista Holdings might mean for their future, with people stopping by throughout the day to share information and voice concerns about the evenings. Presentation. Dr. Amy Foster had spent her afternoon making house calls to elderly residents who might have difficulty attending the community meeting, wanting to ensure that their voices were heard even if they couldn't participate directly in the evening's discussions. Her medical training had taught her to pay attention to the stress symptoms that often preceded community crises, and she'd noted increasing signs of anxiety among residents who were struggling to understand how corporate development might affect their lives. Jake Williams had appointed himself as an unofficial messenger, using his bicycle to carry updates between different parts of the community and keeping everyone informed about developments as they occurred. His teenage energy and genuine concern for Pine Ridge Valley's future had made him a natural focal point for residents who wanted to coordinate their response to Mountain Vista Holdings, but weren't sure how to organize effectively. Father Robert Hayes had spent his afternoon in quiet conversation with community members who were torn between the promise of economic development and their attachment to the mountain lifestyle that had drawn them to Pine Ridge Valley in the first place. His experience counseling people through difficult decisions had given him insight into the complex emotions that corporate pressure could generate in tight-knit communities. As evening approached and residents began gathering at the Pine Ridge Community Center, the conversation inevitably turned to Tom Mitchell and whether his isolation would protect him from whatever changes Mountain Vista Holdings might bring to the upper mountain areas. Most people understood that corporate development plans rarely accommodated individual holdouts, especially when those holdouts controlled strategically important land in remote areas where public attention was limited. Elena had closed the diner early to attend the meeting, leaving behind the familiar environment where she felt most competent and confident to face an evening that would test everything she'd learned about community leadership and collective decision-making. As she walked toward the community center, she found herself thinking about the mountain hermit, who had chosen to remain outside the social networks that made collective action possible. Tom Mitchell might believe that his isolation would protect him from corporate pressure, but Elena understood that development companies had resources and strategies that could make life difficult for anyone who stood in the way of profitable projects. The man who claimed to need nothing more than a corner to sleep might discover that even the most minimal requirements for survival could be threatened by forces much larger and more determined than individual resistance could overcome. The community center buzzed with nervous energy as residents filed in for what everyone understood would be a pivotal moment in Pine Ridge Valley's history. Mountain Vista Holdings had promised a presentation that would explain the benefits that corporate development could bring to their remote community, but most attendees suspected they were about to hear the opening arguments in a negotiation that would determine whether their mountain home remained recognizably their own. As the meeting prepared to begin, the residents of Pine Ridge Valley were united by their shared concern for the future, but divided by their individual circumstances and competing visions of what progress might mean for a community that had always measured success in terms of quality of life rather than economic growth. The decisions they made tonight would affect everyone in the valley, including the hermit on Whispering Pines Mountain, who believed that needing nothing could protect him from caring about the outcome. The Pine Ridge Community Center had never hosted an audience quite like the one that gathered on this particular evening. Every folding chair had been claimed, with additional residents standing along the walls and clustering near the doors in a display of civic engagement that demonstrated just how seriously the community was taking Mountain Vista Holdings' unexpected interest in their remote valley. The building's modest capacity strained to accommodate families who rarely attended anything more formal than school board meetings or holiday celebrations. Elena Rodriguez found herself seated in the front row next to Dr. Amy Foster and Father Robert Hayes, their informal leadership council positioned where they could observe both the corporate presentation and the community's reaction to whatever proposals might emerge. Jake Williams had claimed a spot near the back where his restless teenage energy wouldn't distract from the proceedings, but where he could still monitor the adults whose decisions would shape his future in ways he was only beginning to understand. The atmosphere carried the tense expectation of a community preparing to defend something precious against forces they didn't fully comprehend. Conversations buzzed with nervous energy as neighbors shared last-minute information and voiced concerns that had been building throughout the day. Mary Chun sat with several other elderly residents, their faces reflecting the wisdom that comes from having witnessed previous waves of change that had promised prosperity but delivered complications nobody had anticipated. The Morrison brothers, Danny and Rick, occupied chairs near the center of the room, their weathered faces displaying the skepticism of men who had spent their lives working land that corporations now viewed as assets to be optimized rather than heritage to be preserved. Their family had homesteaded in Pine Ridge Valley 3 generations ago, building a modest ranch operation that provided them with independence and self-sufficiency rather than significant wealth. The prospect of corporate development offered financial opportunities they'd never imagined, but it also threatened to transform their mountain home into something unrecognizable. Sheriff Mike Carson entered the community center with the measured stride of someone who had spent his afternoon delivering unwelcome news to a man who preferred to remain outside the collective concerns that bound communities together in times of crisis. His conversation with Tom Mitchell had confirmed his suspicions that Mountain Vista Holdings represented a more sophisticated threat than Pine Ridge Valley was prepared to handle. But it had also revealed that their most experienced wilderness survival specialist remained determined to face whatever challenges emerged through solitary self-reliance rather than community cooperation. The sheriff's entrance prompted a subtle shift in the room's energy as residents recognized that his expression carried news that wouldn't improve their evening's prospects. Mike had always served as both law enforcement and informal counselor for Pine Ridge Valley, roles that required him to balance official neutrality with genuine concern for the people he'd sworn to protect. Tonight would test his ability to guide the community through decisions that could determine whether their mountain home retained the character that had drawn them to this remote corner of Colorado. Victor Kane made his entrance with the polished confidence of a man accustomed to controlling conversations before they began. The Mountain Vista Holdings representative carried himself with the assured bearing of someone who had conducted similar presentations in dozens of small communities, each one offering the same promises of prosperity and progress that seemed to address the economic anxieties that plagued rural America. His expensive suit and professionally groomed appearance stood in sharp contrast to the practical clothing and weathered faces of Pine Ridge Valley residents, a visual reminder of the different worlds that were about to negotiate over the valley's future. Kane was accompanied by Brad Stevens, whose title of project foreman did little to disguise his primary function as corporate intimidation specialist. Stevens possessed the kind of physical presence that could make people uncomfortable without crossing any obvious lines, a carefully calibrated combination of size and demeanor that suggested violence held in professional restraint. His role in the evening's presentation would be to provide silent reinforcement for whatever proposals Kane might make, a reminder that Mountain Vista Holdings possessed resources beyond financial incentives for communities that proved resistant to corporate persuasion. The presentation began with a slick promotional video that painted Mountain Vista Holdings as a company dedicated to bringing sustainable development to underutilized natural areas throughout the American West. The footage showcased previous projects where corporate investment had transformed struggling rural communities into thriving recreational destinations complete with luxury accommodations, golf courses, ski facilities, and the kind of amenities that attracted wealthy visitors from urban areas seeking authentic mountain experiences. Kane narrated the video with practiced enthusiasm, emphasizing how Mountain Vista Holdings specialized in preserving the natural beauty that made mountain communities special while adding the infrastructure necessary to support modern economic growth. His presentation acknowledged that change could be challenging for long-term residents but stressed that corporate development offered the only realistic path toward economic security in an increasingly competitive global marketplace. Elena found herself studying the faces around her as Kane described the benefits that Mountain Vista Holdings could bring to Pine Ridge Valley. Some residents displayed obvious interest in the financial opportunities that development might provide, particularly those who had watched their children leave for cities because the mountain community couldn't offer career prospects that matched their education and ambitions. Others appeared skeptical of promises that seemed too comprehensive to be entirely honest, their expressions reflecting the wariness that comes from understanding that corporate generosity usually serves corporate interests rather than community welfare. The video concluded with testimonials from residents of other communities where Mountain Vista Holdings had implemented development projects, each speaker praising the company's sensitivity to local concerns and commitment to preserving the qualities that made their mountain homes special. The testimonials felt carefully scripted despite their apparent spontaneity, designed to address the exact concerns that communities like Pine Ridge Valley typically raised when confronted with corporate development proposals. Kane transitioned smoothly from the promotional video to specific proposals for Pine Ridge Valley development, producing detailed maps and architectural renderings that demonstrated Mountain Vista Holdings had conducted extensive research on the area's potential for recreational and residential expansion. The presentations revealed plans for a luxury resort complex on the upper mountain slopes, complete with hiking trails, conference facilities, and residential properties that would attract wealthy buyers seeking second homes in authentic mountain settings. The scope of the proposed development exceeded anything the residents had imagined when they'd first heard rumors about corporate interest in their community. Mountain Vista Holdings envisioned transforming Pine Ridge Valley into a destination resort that would generate hundreds of jobs while preserving the natural beauty that made the area attractive to visitors seeking escape from urban environments. Kane emphasized that existing residents would benefit from increased property values and employment opportunities, while retaining the mountain lifestyle that had drawn them to the valley originally. Dr. Amy Foster raised her hand during the question period that followed Kane's presentation, her medical training having taught her to evaluate claims based on evidence rather than promises. She asked about the environmental impact studies that would be required before any major development could proceed, particularly regarding water usage and waste management systems that could handle the increased population that resort operations would bring to the valley. Kane's response demonstrated the kind of polished evasion that corporate representatives used when confronted with technical questions they preferred not to answer directly. He assured the audience that Mountain Vista Holdings was committed to conducting all necessary environmental assessments and obtaining all required permits before beginning any construction activities. The company had extensive experience navigating regulatory requirements and had never encountered environmental problems that couldn't be addressed through proper planning and modern technology. Father Robert Hayes asked about the timeline for development activities and how quickly changes might begin affecting daily life in Pine Ridge Valley. His question reflected concern for elderly residents and families with limited financial resources, who might find it difficult to adapt to rapid changes in their community's economic and social structure. Kane's response emphasized that Mountain Vista Holdings understood the importance of gradual transition periods that would allow existing residents to adjust to new opportunities at their own pace. Sheriff Mike Carson waited until near the end of the question period before addressing concerns that had been weighing on his mind since his afternoon conversation with Tom Mitchell. He asked about Mountain Vista Holdings' policy regarding property owners who might not be interested in selling their land, particularly those whose holdings occupied strategic locations within the proposed development area. Kane's smile tightened slightly as he addressed what was clearly a question he'd encountered in previous community presentations. He explained that Mountain Vista Holdings preferred to work with willing sellers, but acknowledged that comprehensive development projects sometimes required creative solutions for properties whose owners were initially reluctant to participate. The company had extensive experience helping property owners understand the benefits that development could bring to their personal financial situations, and most initial resistance dissolved once people had time to consider the long-term advantages that corporate investment could provide. Brad Stevens spoke for the first time during the evening, his voice carrying the kind of casual authority that suggested violence held in professional restraint. He mentioned that Mountain Vista Holdings had encountered isolated property owners in previous projects who had initially resisted development, but had eventually recognized that cooperation served their interests better than attempting to maintain unrealistic independence in areas where economic progress was inevitable. Elena felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air seeping through the community center's windows as she absorbed the implications of Stephen's carefully worded statement. The combination of financial incentives and subtle intimidation suggested that Mountain Vista Holdings had developed systematic approaches for dealing with property owners who couldn't be convinced through conventional persuasion that selling their land served their best interests. Jake Williams stood up suddenly from his position near the back of the room, his teenage directness cutting through the polished diplomatic language that had characterized most of the evening's discussion. He asked whether Mountain Vista Holdings had any experience dealing with property owners who possessed wilderness survival skills and might be prepared to defend their land through methods that corporate security teams weren't equipped to handle. The question prompted nervous laughter from some residents who understood that Jake was referring to Tom Mitchell, though the teenager had been careful not to mention the mountain hermit by name. Kane's response demonstrated that Mountain Vista Holdings had indeed researched the community thoroughly enough to be aware of the isolated property owner whose land occupied a strategic position within their development plans. The corporate representative assured the audience that Mountain Vista Holdings had extensive experience working with individuals who possessed specialized skills and preferred independent lifestyles. The company understood that mountain communities often included residents whose backgrounds and capabilities required respectful acknowledgement, and corporate policy emphasized cooperation rather than confrontation whenever possible. Stevens added that Mountain Vista Holdings maintained professional relationships with security specialists who understood how to communicate effectively with people whose life experiences had taught them to be suspicious of outside authority. The community meeting concluded with Kane distributing information packets that contained detailed financial projections and preliminary property assessments for every significant landholding in Pine Ridge Valley. The packets included personalized estimates of what Mountain Vista Holdings might be prepared to offer individual property owners, numbers that reflected the company's sophisticated understanding of each residents' financial situation and potential motivations for selling their land. Elena accepted her packet with reluctance, understanding that the personalized attention demonstrated Mountain Vista Holdings had conducted research that extended far beyond simple property surveys. The company knew which residents were struggling financially, which families had children whose education costs were straining household budgets, which elderly property owners might be concerned about leaving their heirs with land that generated no income. The level of detailed preparation suggested that tonight's presentation was merely the opening move in a campaign that had been planned with military precision. As residents filed out of the community center, conversations buzzed with reactions that ranged from excitement about unexpected financial opportunities to concern about changes that might destroy the qualities that made Pine Ridge Valley worth preserving. The Morrison brothers clustered with other ranching families to discuss whether development money might solve economic problems that had been plaguing agricultural operations for years. Mary Chun walked slowly with other elderly residents, their faces reflecting uncertainty about whether corporate promises could be trusted by people whose fixed incomes made them vulnerable to economic changes beyond their control. Dr. Amy Foster found herself surrounded by families with questions about how resort development might affect access to medical care and educational opportunities for their children. The promises of economic growth sounded attractive in theory, but the practical implications of transforming Pine Ridge Valley into a destination resort raised concerns about whether long-term residents would still be able to afford living in their own community once property values and cost of living increased to match the area's new recreational economy. Sheriff Mike Carson lingered near the community center entrance, observing the residents as they processed what they'd learned and began forming opinions about how Mountain Vista Holdings might affect their individual circumstances. His law enforcement experience had taught him to recognize when communities were being divided by external pressures, and he could see the early signs of the kind of internal conflict that corporate development often generated in tight-knit rural areas. Jake Williams approached the sheriff with the determined expression of a teenager. who had recognized that adult decisions would affect his future in ways that required his active participation rather than passive acceptance. He asked Mike directly whether Tom Mitchell had been warned about Mountain Vista Holdings and whether the mountain hermit understood that his isolation wouldn't protect him from corporate pressure tactics that had proven effective in other remote communities. Mike's response was carefully neutral, acknowledging that he'd spoken with Tom about the evening's presentation while respecting the mountain hermit's privacy regarding his personal response to the information. The sheriff understood that Tom's reaction to corporate pressure would depend on factors that extended far beyond simple property ownership, involving psychological wounds that had driven him to seek isolation in the first place in survival. Instincts that might respond unpredictably to threats against the sanctuary he'd built for himself. Elena joined their conversation as other residents continued dispersing to their homes, her practical nature asserting itself over the emotional complexity of the evening's revelations. She pointed out that Tom Mitchell's property occupied the most strategic position within Mountain Vista Holdings' development plans, controlling access to water sources and commanding views that would be essential for any luxury resort operation. His cooperation wasn't optional from the corporation's perspective. It was necessary for their project's success. The three of them stood in the community center parking lot as the last residents departed, each lost in thoughts about the implications of corporate attention for a community that had always operated on the assumption that they were too small and remote to attract outside interference. Mountain Vista Holdings had demonstrated resources and preparation that suggested Pine Ridge Valley was facing challenges that would require more sophisticated responses than their informal leadership council had ever needed to coordinate. As Elena drove home through streets that suddenly felt different under the weight of corporate scrutiny, she found herself thinking about the mountain hermit, who had chosen complete isolation over the messy complications of human connection. Tom Mitchell's philosophy of needing nothing more than a corner to sleep had protected him from the disappointments and losses that inevitably accompanied caring about other people, but it might also leave him unprepared for the kind of systematic pressure that development companies could apply when individual resistance stood in the way of profitable projects. The evening's presentation had revealed that Mountain Vista Holdings understood Pine Ridge Valley's vulnerabilities better than most residents realized, having conducted research that extended far beyond simple property surveys to include detailed assessments of each family's financial situation and personal motivations. The company's representatives had demonstrated the kind of professional competence that came from having conducted similar campaigns in dozens of other communities, refining their approaches based on lessons learned from previous encounters with rural resistance to corporate development. Tom Mitchell might believe that 8 years of successful isolation had prepared him to handle whatever challenges corporate pressure might present, but Elena suspected that Mountain Vista Holdings possessed resources and strategies that could make life difficult for anyone who stood in the way of their development plans. The man who claimed to need nothing might discover that even the most minimal requirements for survival could be threatened by forces much larger and more determined than individual self-reliance could overcome. As the mountain community settled into an uneasy sleep, the residents of Pine Ridge Valley found themselves facing questions that would test everything they thought they knew about their ability to control their own destiny. The corporate presentation had offered financial opportunities that some families desperately needed, but it had also revealed the extent to which outside forces had been studying their community, with predatory attention to detail that suggested negotiation might be less optional than Kane's polished presentation had implied. 3 miles up a winding mountain trail, Tom Mitchell sat on his cabin porch in the darkness, his eyes scanning the valley lights below while his mind processed the implications of Sheriff Carson's afternoon warning. The isolation that had protected him from human disappointment for 8 years suddenly felt less like sanctuary and more like strategic disadvantage, leaving him unprepared for challenges that might require the kind of community cooperation He'd deliberately trained himself to live without. The corporate interest in Pine Ridge Valley represented more than just development pressure. It symbolized the collision between individual, self-reliance and collective action that would determine whether their mountain home retained the character that had drawn them to this remote corner of Colorado. Tom's choice to remain outside the social networks that made resistance possible might prove to be a luxury he could no longer afford, regardless of how successfully his philosophy of minimal needs had served him during 8 years of deliberate withdrawal from human connection. Dawn broke cold and gray over Whispering Pines Mountain, painting the sky in shades that matched Tom Mitchell's mood as he stood on his cabin porch, surveying the valley that had suddenly become the center of unwanted attention. The peaceful isolation he'd cultivated for 8 years felt different now, charged with the awareness that corporate eyes were studying his mountain sanctuary with the calculating gaze of predators who had identified their primary target. Sleep had come fitfully during the night, interrupted by thoughts that refused to stay buried, despite his years of practice at emotional detachment. The sound of approaching vehicles drifted up from the valley below, engines straining against mountain grades that most city drivers found challenging even in good weather. Tom's wilderness-trained senses automatically cataloged the sounds, noting that multiple trucks were making their way up roads that rarely saw traffic beyond the occasional delivery or emergency response. The timing suggested that Mountain Vista Holdings was wasting no time implementing whatever plans they'd developed for dealing with resistant property owners. Tom moved through his morning routine with the mechanical precision that had sustained him through 8 years of deliberate isolation, but his attention kept drifting to the valley where corporate activity was already disrupting the peaceful rhythm that had made his retreat possible. He'd chosen this location specifically because it offered commanding views while remaining virtually invisible to casual observation, positioning himself where he could monitor the world he'd abandoned without being forced to participate in its complications. That strategic advantage was about to become a liability as his elevated position made him the obvious focus for anyone seeking to control the upper mountain areas. The first corporate vehicle appeared on the old mining road that provided the closest vehicular access to Tom's trail. A heavy-duty pickup truck, followed by what appeared to be surveying equipment and additional personnel whose purpose wasn't immediately obvious from his distant vantage point. Tom retrieved the military-grade binoculars he'd maintained since his search and rescue days, equipment that had saved lives during emergency operations and now served to monitor threats to the sanctuary he'd built through 8 years of careful withdrawal from human contact. Through the binoculars, Tom could see Brad Stevens directing a team of men who moved with the disciplined efficiency of former military personnel rather than the casual competence of typical construction workers. Their equipment included surveying instruments, but also communication gear and vehicles that suggested they were prepared for operations that might extend beyond simple property assessment. Stevens himself carried the bearing of someone accustomed to command authority through physical presence rather than corporate charm, his role clearly different from Victor Kane's diplomatic facade. The corporate team established what appeared to be a temporary command post at the base of the trail that led to Tom's cabin, positioning themselves where they could monitor his movements while maintaining the fiction that their presence was related to legitimate surveying activities rather than targeted pressure on a specific property owner. Their deployment demonstrated the kind of strategic thinking that suggested Mountain Vista Holdings had encountered resistant property owners before and had developed systematic approaches for dealing with individuals who couldn't be convinced through conventional persuasion. Tom observed the corporate team's activities with the detached analysis that had kept him alive during search and rescue operations in hostile terrain, noting their equipment capabilities and deployment patterns, while suppressing the emotional responses that might cloud his tactical assessment. 8 years of isolation had taught him to evaluate threats without allowing personal feelings to interfere with objective decision-making. But the sight of armed men establishing positions near his sanctuary triggered memories of the protective instincts that had once defined his professional identity. The irony wasn't lost on him that the same analytical skills he'd used to save lives were now being applied to protect the isolation he'd chosen after failing to save the people who had trusted him most. The avalanche that had claimed his rescue team had taught him that caring about others inevitably led to devastating loss, but the corporate presence below was forcing him to confront the possibility that complete withdrawal might not protect him from situations that required decisive action to survive. As the morning progressed, Tom noticed additional changes in the valley that suggested Mountain Vista Holdings was implementing a comprehensive campaign rather than limiting their activities to his specific property. Vehicles moved between various locations throughout Pine Ridge Valley. Corporate personnel appeared to be conducting interviews with residents, and the overall pattern of activity indicated that the company was moving aggressively to establish control over the entire development area while resistance remained unorganized. The sound of a single vehicle approaching his trail prompted Tom to focus his attention on more immediate concerns. Unlike the corporate convoy, this engine note was familiar, belonging to Sheriff Mike Carson's patrol vehicle, making the difficult climb to deliver news that probably wouldn't improve Tom's assessment of his situation. The timing suggested that whatever corporate pressure was being applied in the valley had reached levels that required law enforcement attention, though Tom suspected Mike's visit was motivated more by personal concern than official duties. Tom waited on his porch as Mike completed the challenging drive up the mountain trail, noting that the sheriff's expression carried the grim determination of someone delivering news that would force difficult decisions on people who weren't prepared to make them. 8 years of isolation had made Tom sensitive to the subtle signs of stress in the few people whose paths still crossed his own, and Mike's body language suggested that Mountain Vista Holdings had escalated their campaign beyond the polite corporate diplomacy of the previous evening's presentation. The sheriff emerged from his vehicle with movements that showed the strain of sleepless hours spent dealing with problems that extended beyond normal law enforcement responsibilities. Mike had always served Pine Ridge Valley as both official authority and informal counselor, roles that required him to balance legal requirements with genuine concern for people whose lives were being disrupted by forces beyond their control. Today's visit would test his ability to maintain that balance while delivering information that might force Tom to abandon the isolation that had protected him from human complications for nearly a decade. Tom, they've started making direct offers to property owners, Mike said without preamble, his tone indicating that diplomatic pleasantries would waste time neither of them could afford. Victor Kane and his team have been visiting residents since dawn, presenting individual contracts that make the general promises from last night's meeting very specific and very immediate. Tom's expression didn't change, but Mike caught the slight tightening around his eyes that indicated increased attention, despite his studied indifference to community affairs. The sheriff understood that Tom's apparent detachment was a protective mechanism rather than genuine lack of concern, a way of maintaining emotional distance from problems that might require him to risk caring about outcomes he couldn't control. Some people are signing, Mike continued, choosing his words carefully to convey the seriousness of the situation without sounding like he was trying to manipulate Tom into involvement. The Morrison brothers took Mountain Vista Holdings' offer for their ranch property, said the money was too good to pass up, and they were ready to retire anyway. Mary Chun is considering their proposal for the general store, though she's worried about what happens to elderly residents if the community loses its only local supplier. The news that his neighbors were already accepting corporate buyouts didn't surprise Tom, though he found himself calculating the strategic implications, despite his commitment to emotional detachment. If Mountain Vista Holdings was acquiring property systematically, his isolated position would become increasingly vulnerable as corporate control expanded around him. The company's representatives had probably anticipated resistance from remote property owners and planned their acquisition strategy to isolate holdouts from potential community support. Alina Rodriguez turned them down flat, Mike added, and Tom caught the note of respect in the sheriff's voice. Told Kane that her diner was the heart of the community and wasn't for sale at any price. Dr. Amy Foster had similar words for their proposal to modernize the valley's medical facilities. Father Robert Hayes suggested they might want to reconsider their development plans in light of moral obligations to existing residents. Tom absorbed this information while maintaining his emotional defenses against caring too much about other people's decisions, but he found himself inadvertently cataloging which community members were standing firm against corporate pressure and which were accepting buyout offers. The pattern suggested that Mountain Vista Holdings was dividing Pine Ridge Valley along predictable lines, targeting financially vulnerable residents, while applying different pressure tactics to those whose cooperation couldn't be purchased through simple monetary incentives. They've set up a base camp at the bottom of your trail, Mike said finally, delivering the news that Tom had been expecting since observing the corporate team's arrival. Brad Stevens claims they're conducting environmental surveys for the development project, but he's got enough men and equipment to handle more than paperwork. Kane mentioned that they'd like to schedule a meeting with you to discuss opportunities for mutually beneficial cooperation. The euphemistic language couldn't disguise the fact that Mountain Vista Holdings was implementing systematic pressure on the property owner whose cooperation was essential for their development plans. Tom's cabin controlled access to the watershed that would supply any resort operation, commanded views that corporate marketing would consider essential for luxury accommodations, and occupied the strategic high ground that would determine whether their project succeeded or failed. His consent wasn't optional from the company's perspective. It was necessary for their investment to generate the profits that justified their presence in Pine Ridge Valley. Tom resumed his wood splitting as Mike delivered his report, the rhythmic sound of his axe providing a familiar counterpoint to information that threatened to disrupt the carefully constructed isolation he'd maintained for 8 years. The corporate pressure was exactly what he'd expected when Mike had first warned him about Mountain Vista Holdings, but the reality of armed men positioning themselves near his sanctuary forced him to confront decisions he'd hoped to avoid through continued withdrawal from human complications. How long before they decide that polite requests aren't working? Tom asked quietly, his question acknowledging both his understanding of corporate tactics and his recognition that the situation had moved beyond simple property negotiations. Mike studied his former friend with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent decades evaluating people under stress, noting the subtle signs that suggested Tom's philosophy of complete detachment was being tested by circumstances that might require active responses rather than passive resistance. Not long, Mike replied honestly. Stevens isn't the type who waits around for people to change their minds voluntarily. Kane might keep talking about cooperation and mutual benefits, but his foreman is here to apply whatever pressure is necessary to get results. Corporate development companies don't invest this kind of resources in projects that can be derailed by individual property owners who refuse to see reason. Tom set down his axe and turned to face Mike directly, 8 years of deliberate isolation temporarily suspended by the need to understand exactly what kind of threat he was facing. The man who had trained himself not to care about outcomes beyond his immediate survival was discovering that strategic thinking required him to consider possibilities that extended beyond his cabin's wooden walls and the mountain sanctuary he'd created through years of careful withdrawal from human contact. What kind of pressure are we talking about? Tom asked, his voice carrying the professional tone he'd once used when evaluating rescue operations that involved multiple variables and uncertain outcomes. Mike recognized the shift in his former friend's demeanor, noting that the mountain hermit was beginning to think tactically rather than simply maintaining defensive isolation against unwanted complications. The kind that starts with legal harassment and escalates to whatever level gets results, Mike said carefully. Environmental violations, building code infractions, property tax assessments, access road maintenance requirements. Corporate lawyers can find ways to make life expensive and complicated for people who don't want to cooperate with development projects. Tom nodded slowly, understanding that Mountain Vista Holdings possessed resources that could make his minimalist lifestyle impossible to maintain, without engaging in exactly the kind of complex legal and financial battles that his retreat to the mountain had been designed to avoid. The philosophy of needing nothing more than a corner to sleep offered limited protection against systematic pressure from forces that specialize in making basic survival requirements dependent on corporate cooperation. And if legal pressure doesn't work, Mike continued reluctantly, Stevens has the kind of background that suggests Mountain Vista Holdings is prepared to use methods that don't require court approval. Corporate security can be very creative when they need to convince property owners that selling serves their best interests better than maintaining unrealistic independence. The implications of Mike's warning settled over Tom like the mountain mists that sometimes obscured his valley views, forcing him to acknowledge that 8 years of successful isolation might have left him unprepared for threats that required community cooperation to resist effectively. His wilderness survival skills had protected him from natural dangers and seasonal challenges, but corporate pressure operated according to rules that individual self-reliance couldn't overcome. Tom found himself thinking about the people in Pine Ridge Valley who had shown kindness during his rare trips to town for essential supplies, residents who had respected his privacy while demonstrating the kind of quiet concern that characterized genuine community. Elena Rodriguez had never pushed conversation beyond simple transactions, but her diner had provided him with hot meals during winter storms, when his own provisions had run low. Dr. Amy Foster had treated a severe cut on his hand 3 years ago without asking uncomfortable questions about how he'd injured himself or why he'd waited so long to seek medical attention. The memory of these small kindnesses created an uncomfortable tension with his commitment to emotional detachment, reminding him that complete isolation was possible only because good people were willing to provide essential services without demanding reciprocal involvement in their lives and problems. His retreat to the mountain had been sustained by a community that asked nothing from him while remaining available when his self-sufficiency proved inadequate for serious emergencies. Jake Williams appeared at the edge of Tom's clearing as Mike prepared to leave, the teenager having made the difficult climb up the mountain trail with the determined energy that characterized his approach to everything he considered important. His arrival surprised both adults, though Tom noted that the boy moved through wilderness terrain with competence that suggested genuine respect for the mountains, dangers rather than teenage overconfidence in his own abilities. Mr. Mitchell, Jake said directly, his tone carrying the straightforward honesty that adults often found either refreshing or disturbing in teenagers who hadn't yet learned to disguise their thoughts behind diplomatic language. I know you don't want to be involved in community problems, but Mountain Vista Holdings isn't going to leave you alone just because you live up here by yourself. Tom studied the teenager with interest, recognizing something in the boy's bearing that reminded him of his younger self before tragedy had taught him that caring about other people inevitably led to devastating loss. Jake possessed the kind of direct engagement with the world that Tom remembered from his search and rescue days, when problems had solutions and dedication could overcome obstacles through proper planning and determined execution. They're not just trying to buy people out, Jake continued, his teenage directness cutting through the careful diplomatic language that had characterized most discussions about Mountain Vista Holdings. They're threatening families who won't sell, making life difficult for anyone who stands in their way. Mrs. Rodriguez is scared they're going to find ways to shut down her diner. Dr. Foster thinks they might cut off medical supplies to force her to leave, and Father Hayes says they've already started spreading rumors about the church's tax-exempt status. The information painted a picture of systematic intimidation that extended far beyond simple property acquisition, suggesting that Mountain Vista Holdings was implementing comprehensive pressure designed to break community resistance through coordinated attacks on the institutions that made Pine Ridge Valley function as a coherent social unit. Tom found himself involuntarily cataloging the tactical implications despite his commitment to remaining uninvolved in collective problems that required group solutions. Tom absorbed Jake's report while maintaining his emotional defenses against caring too much about other people's welfare. But the teenager's obvious concern for the community made it difficult to dismiss the information as irrelevant to his own situation. If Mountain Vista Holdings was systematically dismantling the social networks that made Pine Ridge Valley function, his isolation would become meaningless because the community that provided essential services would cease to exist. They know. You're the key to their whole project, Jake said with the blunt assessment that teenagers often applied to situations that adults preferred to discuss in more diplomatic terms. Your property controls everything they need for their resort development. Water access, the best views, strategic position for luxury accommodations. They can't succeed without your cooperation, which means they're not going to stop pressuring you until they get what they want. Tom's silence stretched long enough for Mike to recognize that his former friend was processing information that challenged the carefully constructed philosophy he'd used to justify 8 years of deliberate withdrawal from human connection. The sheriff understood that asking Tom to involve himself in community affairs meant asking him to risk caring about outcomes that might require him to fail other people again, reopening psychological wounds that had driven him to seek isolation in the first place. "What do you want from me?" Tom asked finally, his question directed more to himself than to his visitors, but carrying enough volume for them to hear his internal struggle with competing obligations. Jake and Mike exchanged glances that acknowledged the significance of Tom's first direct engagement with community problems since his retreat to the mountain nearly a decade ago. "We want you to help us figure out how to protect people who can't protect themselves," Jake replied with the honesty that had characterized his entire approach to the conversation. "Mountain Vista Holdings has corporate lawyers and security specialists and more money than anyone in Pine Ridge Valley has ever seen. We have good intentions and Sheriff Carson, but that's not going to be enough if they decide to get serious about removing obstacles to their development plans." Tom found himself remembering the rescue operations that had defined his professional identity before the avalanche, had taught him that good intentions and tactical competence couldn't guarantee successful outcomes when natural forces proved stronger than human planning. The corporate pressure threatening Pine Ridge Valley represented a different kind of avalanche, one that would bury the community's independence under systematic legal and financial pressure designed to make resistance impossible to sustain. The mountain hermit who had spent 8 years convincing himself that needing nothing could protect him from human complications was discovering that isolation offered limited defense against forces determined to make his sanctuary part of their profit calculations. Mountain Vista Holdings wasn't requesting his cooperation. They were implementing strategies designed to make his resistance impossible to maintain, regardless of his commitment to emotional detachment from community affairs. As afternoon shadows began lengthening across his clearing, Tom stood on the edge of a decision that would determine whether his 8-year retreat from human connection had been wisdom or cowardice. The corporate presence below represented exactly the kind of complex human problem he'd trained himself to avoid. But avoiding it might mean watching good people suffer consequences they couldn't prevent through their own efforts alone. The decision crystallized in Tom Mitchell's mind with the sudden clarity that had once guided him through life-or-death rescue operations, cutting through 8 years of carefully constructed emotional barriers like lightning splitting the mountain sky. He stood in his cabin doorway as Jake Williams and Sheriff Mike Carson prepared to leave, watching the corporate vehicles position themselves strategically throughout the valley below, and understood with absolute certainty that his philosophy of needing nothing had become a luxury he could no longer afford. The sound of helicopter rotors approaching from the south confirmed what Tom's tactical instincts had been telling him all afternoon. Mountain Vista Holdings was escalating their campaign beyond ground-based pressure, bringing in aerial surveillance. That would eliminate any remaining privacy his mountain sanctuary had provided. The helicopter's flight pattern suggested professional reconnaissance rather than casual observation, mapping his property and identifying the tactical advantages that his elevated position had offered during 8 years of successful isolation. Tom moved through his cabin with purposeful efficiency, gathering equipment he hadn't touched since his search and rescue days but had maintained with the unconscious competence of someone whose survival had once depended on reliable gear. The emergency radio went into his pack alongside medical supplies, wilderness navigation tools, and the communication equipment that connected him to county emergency services. His hands moved with muscle memory that transcended conscious thought, preparing for operations that would require all the skills he'd spent 8 years trying to forget. The transformation was both physical and psychological, as if the mountain hermit who had claimed to need nothing more than a corner to sleep was revealing himself to have been an elaborate disguise, worn by a man whose true nature involved protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. Tom's movements became fluid and purposeful, his bearing shifting from defensive isolation to the confident competence that had once made him legendary among search and rescue specialists throughout Colorado's mountain counties. He emerged from his cabin carrying equipment that would have seemed excessive for a simple property dispute, but was perfectly appropriate for someone who understood that Mountain Vista Holdings represented the kind of systematic threat that required coordinated resistance to overcome. The corporate security team positioned at the base of his trail had probably expected to intimidate an isolated hermit who lacked resources for sustained conflict, but they were about to encounter a professional who had spent years keeping people alive in conditions that should have killed them. Tom's first priority was establishing secure communication with the community members who were still resisting corporate pressure, creating the kind of coordinated response network that his search and rescue experience had taught him was essential for successful operations in hostile terrain. Elena Rodriguez, Dr. Amy Foster, Father Robert Hayes, and the other residents who had refused Mountain Vista Holdings buyout offers needed to understand that they weren't facing this threat alone, that someone with relevant expertise was finally ready to help them organize effective resistance. The descent to Pine Ridge Valley took Tom through terrain he knew better than anyone else in the county, following game trails and natural cover that would keep him invisible to corporate surveillance, while allowing him to observe their deployment patterns and communication procedures. 8 years of daily movement through this wilderness had given him tactical advantages that no amount of corporate planning could anticipate. Intimate knowledge of every ridge and gully that could provide concealment or strategic position. Tom's arrival at Elena's diner after dark surprised the small group of residents who had gathered to discuss their increasingly desperate situation, but his presence transformed their worried conversations into tactical planning sessions guided by someone who understood how to coordinate complex operations under pressure. Elena, Mike, Amy, Father Robert, and Jake found themselves listening to detailed assessments of Mountain Vista Holdings, vulnerabilities, and specific recommendations for countering corporate pressure tactics through organized community action. The mountain hermit who had spent 8 years avoiding human complications revealed himself to possess exactly the kind of strategic thinking and operational experience that their resistance movement needed to survive corporate pressure designed to break individual resolve through systematic intimidation. Tom's analysis of their situation was both sobering and encouraging, acknowledging the serious nature of the threat while outlining specific actions that could protect the community if everyone was willing to coordinate their efforts according to professional tactical principles. Mountain Vista Holdings had made the classic mistake of assuming that rural communities lacked the sophistication to organize effective resistance against corporate pressure, but they hadn't anticipated encountering someone whose background included training in exactly the kind of coordinated operations that could turn their strategic advantages into tactical disadvantages. Tom explained how their surveillance equipment could be neutralized, their communication systems disrupted, and their personnel forced to operate in terrain where local knowledge provided decisive advantages to defenders who understood the mountain environment. The transformation of Pine Ridge Valley's resistance from individual acts of defiance to coordinated community action happened with remarkable speed once Tom's leadership provided the tactical framework that had been missing from their previous efforts. Elena's Diner became the unofficial command center where information was gathered and distributed. Dr. Foster's medical expertise was integrated into comprehensive emergency response planning, and Father Hayes's moral authority was enlisted to maintain community unity during operations that would test everyone's commitment to preserving their mountain home. Jake Williams emerged as a natural liaison between the adult leadership and the younger residents whose energy and local knowledge made them ideal for surveillance and communication, duties that required mobility and discretion. Tom recognized something in the teenager that reminded him of his own younger self, the kind of dedication and tactical thinking that could be developed into genuine competence if properly guided and channeled toward protecting people who mattered. The first test of their coordinated resistance came when Mountain Vista Holdings attempted to cut off essential services to residents who had refused their buyout offers, using corporate influence to pressure utility companies and supply chains that supported Pine Ridge Valley's basic infrastructure. Tom's response demonstrated the kind of strategic thinking that had made him legendary among search and rescue specialists, coordinating alternative supply networks and backup systems that kept the community functioning despite corporate efforts to make resistance economically impossible. Victor Kane's reaction to organized resistance was predictably aggressive, escalating from polite corporate pressure to the kind of direct intimidation that Brad Stevens specialized in applying to communities that couldn't defend themselves against professional security operations. Their mistake was assuming that Tom Mitchell remained the isolated hermit who could be neutralized through individual pressure rather than recognizing that he had become the tactical coordinator for a community that was no longer willing to accept corporate domination of their mountain home. The confrontation that determined Pine Ridge Valley's future took place not in dramatic violence but in the kind of systematic campaign that tested everyone's commitment to preserving what they had built together over generations of mountain living. Tom's leadership provided the tactical framework that allowed community members to coordinate their resistance effectively, while their collective determination provided the moral foundation that made sustained opposition possible despite corporate pressure designed to break individual resolve. Mountain Vista Holdings discovered that rural communities could indeed organize sophisticated resistance when they possessed proper leadership and understood that their survival depended on collective action rather than individual accommodation to corporate demands. The company's representatives found themselves operating in terrain where local knowledge provided decisive advantages to defenders who understood every ridge and gully better than any amount of professional preparation could anticipate. The resolution came when Mountain Vista Holdings recognized that their development project was no longer economically viable given the level of organized resistance they were encountering from a community that had transformed from isolated individuals into a coordinated tactical unit under Tom Mitchell's guidance. Corporate cost-benefit analysis eventually concluded that Pine Ridge Valley represented more trouble than profit, leading to strategic withdrawal rather than continued escalation against opposition that had proven more sophisticated than their initial assessments had suggested. Tom's integration back into community life happened gradually, as if 8 years of isolation were being unwound through daily acts of connection that rebuilt the social bonds he had severed after losing his rescue team to the avalanche. His cabin on Whispering Pines Mountain remained his primary residence, but it no longer served as fortress against human contact. Instead, it became a strategic observation post where community security could be monitored and emergency response coordinated when mountain conditions required professional wilderness expertise. Elena's Diner resumed its role as the community's informal gathering place, but now it also functioned as the coordination center where Tom's tactical planning merged with local knowledge to create comprehensive emergency response capabilities. That made Pine Ridge Valley more resilient than it had ever been before. The corporate threat had forced the community to discover strengths they hadn't known they possessed, capabilities that would serve them well in future challenges that mountain living would inevitably present. Dr. Amy Foster found herself working with Tom to develop medical response protocols that integrated his wilderness emergency training with her clinical expertise, creating comprehensive healthcare capabilities that could handle everything from routine community medical needs to serious mountain rescue operations. Their collaboration demonstrated how individual expertise could be multiplied through community cooperation, achieving results that neither could have accomplished working alone. Father Robert Hayes discovered that Tom's return to community involvement had spiritual dimensions that extended beyond simple tactical coordination, representing the kind of redemption that came from choosing to care about other people despite the risks that emotional investment inevitably entailed. The mountain hermit's transformation from isolated survivor to community protector illustrated the theological principle that individual salvation often required collective service to others who needed protection and support. Jake Williams continued developing the tactical thinking and community leadership skills that Tom's mentorship had begun to cultivate, growing into the kind of person who could eventually assume responsibility for protecting Pine Ridge Valley. When the older generation was no longer able to provide the expertise that mountain living required, his relationship with Tom represented the kind of knowledge transfer that ensured community resilience across generations. Sheriff Mike Carson watched his former friend's reintegration into community life with satisfaction that went beyond professional relief at having resolved the corporate pressure threatening his jurisdiction. Tom's return to active engagement with human problems represented personal healing from psychological wounds that had driven him to seek isolation, demonstrating that recovery from trauma sometimes required exactly the kind of meaningful connections that survivors initially found too dangerous to risk. The philosophy that had sustained Tom Mitchell through 8 years of mountain isolation underwent fundamental transformation as he discovered that needing nothing was less important than having something worth protecting. His cabin still provided the corner to sleep that he had claimed was sufficient for survival, but it now anchored a life that included relationships and responsibilities that gave meaning to survival beyond simple biological persistence. Pine Ridge Valley had survived its encounter with corporate development pressure, stronger and more unified than before the crisis began. But the real victory was personal rather than tactical. Tom Mitchell had discovered that the heart he had thought was too damaged to risk caring about other people was actually capable of expanding to include an entire community that needed his protection and expertise. The mountain hermit who had claimed to need nothing had made room in his heart for everything that made life worth living. The seasons continued their ancient cycle around Whispering Pines Mountain, but the man who watched them from his cabin porch was no longer counting time until the next day's survival challenges. Instead, he was planning community activities that would strengthen the bonds, connecting him to people whose welfare had become as important as his own continued existence. The corner that had once been sufficient for sleeping had become the foundation for a life that included everything he had thought he could never afford to lose again. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.